Welcome to the deep dive. If you're like most people, when you think about managing your finances, you probably feel instantly overloaded.
Oh, absolutely. We're just bombarded with all this advice, right? Budget this, save that, max out your 401k.
And you try. You really do. But the moment you actually try to follow those steps, you just hit a wall. It's like this sudden wave of anxiety or guilt.
Or that paralyzing feeling where you just avoid it all. Or maybe even the total opposite, an impulse to just go out and overspend.
It's a truly exhausting and honestly a really frustrating cycle.
It is. And the reason that traditional advice so often fails is because it treats money as if it's pure math. And it completely ignores the human operating system running underneath.
And that's really what we're digging into today. The sources we've compiled take a fundamentally different approach. Our mission here is to decode this stack of material that treats money not just as, an economic concept,
But as psychology, biology, and history, all of it focused really intensely on this phenomenon that we're now calling financial trauma.
And this is the core insight that frames this whole deep dive for us.
Yeah.
Your financial struggles are almost never just about personal failure or a lack of math skills.
Not at all. They're so often rooted in systemic issues, in these deeply inherited behavioral patterns, and in your body's actual physical response to what it perceives as a threat.
We're trying to move past this toxic and really pervasive idea that if you're struggling, you simply need to be, quote, smarter and work harder.
Well, that phrase, smarter and work harder, that's the vocabulary of shame. I mean, you could even call it a form of societal gaslighting.
That's a powerful way to put it.
For a long time, the term financial trauma was kind of locked away, behind academic walls. It was used really narrowly to describe a single flashpoint event, like going through a bankruptcy or a foreclosure.
Right, a big P trauma, as they call it.
Exactly. But the materials we've analyzed, they define it so much more broadly. They show that financial trauma includes the compounded stress of just navigating these complex and often, frankly, hostile economic systems.
And it also includes the pain we absorb just by watching others suffer.
Right.
That idea of vicarious trauma.
Yes, vicarious trauma. And even the biological transfer of anxiety and stress responses from one generation to the next. It's fascinating and it's deep.
So if you've been wrestling with that guilt or that paralysis or just a lot of self-doubt because the usual financial advice hasn't worked for you, this deep dive is, it's your validation.
And to guide us through this incredibly dense and sensitive terrain, the sources give us a really clear roadmap. We're going to adopt the framework they lay out.
It's called the 3 E's of overcoming financial trauma. That's exposure, education, and execution.
And this framework provides a logical, really actionable path forward. Exposure is that critical first step, becoming deeply aware of the trauma and tracing where it came from.
Then education, which is all about understanding the context, the biology, and how it's actually affecting your mind and your body.
And finally, execution. This is where we implement trauma-responsive strategies for real, lasting behavioral and even physiological healing.
Okay, so let's jump right in with that essential first step. Exposure.
Let's do it.
When we talk about exposure, we really have to start by identifying our own financial origin story. And the author in one of our main sources shared this profoundly moving anecdote that I think is a perfect place to start.
I agree. He describes coming home from school, I think he was in high school, and seeing an eviction notice taped, of all places, right on the front door.
On the front door.
Yeah.
The public shame of that.
That image, that is a classic financial trauma trigger. He describes this immediate, just visceral flood of emotions hitting him in less than 30 seconds. Fear, confusion.
And overwhelming embarrassment. That's what he focused on. His first thought wasn't, where are we going to live? It was, how many of our neighbors saw this? Everyone knows our secret.
Exactly. And that single moment cemented this feeling of being completely powerless financially.
Yeah.
He internalized a huge systemic failure as some kind of personal defect, even though he was just a kid.
And that one event, it just rapidly molded his entire financial blueprint. His whole money story became rooted in absolute scarcity.
And we read his account of what he calls his survival money story. It's things like figuring out how to budget food stamps down to the very last penny, always having to choose the cheapest store brands.
He even mentioned learning survival skills, like boiling water on the gas stove, just to be able to bathe when the power was, inevitably shut off.
And he felt this immense pressure to become this savvy and responsible custodian of the household's finances. But that whole identity was built on this shaky foundation of just perpetual lack.
What's so critical here, and the sources really stress this, is the subjectivity of it all, even inside the same house.
Right. He talks about realizing later that the truth he lived, that constant scarcity, the high anxiety, it wasn't the exact objective truth for everyone in his family.
His younger brother, for instance, lived part-time at their father's house, which was a completely different financial reality.
And his younger sister was just too young to really grasp the gravity of what was happening. So what that means is, within one single household, you can have these radically different money stories, different trauma experiences.
Between siblings, between a husband and wife.
Yeah.
Each person creating their own unique script for how to survive.
Exactly. And these scripts, they're so rarely just about the present moment. They are generational blueprints.
The sources talk about how these inherited experiences, they dictate what money actually represents to us. It's so much more than just buying power.
For some, it's security. For others, it's freedom or power or status.
And for Black Americans and other communities who have gone through colonization and systemic denial of opportunity, the subconscious value of money it's just inextricably tied to a history of mistreatment.
It's tied to this relentless pursuit of self-determination and this really deep-rooted desire to simply be treated as a full human being.
That's a really profound distinction.
It is. Because subconsciously, that intense generational pressure to work twice as hard, it's not just about getting paid more. It's often tied to avoiding economic abuse, to acquiring freedom, to being able to control your own destiny.
These are deep, unspoken ancestral rules for survival that just get passed down.
Right. If your family history involves having your land taken or being denied credit or violent economic displacement, money stops being just a tool. It becomes a shield against history repeating itself.
So if the generational blueprint is what we inherit, then vicarious trauma is what we absorb just by watching.
Yes. Let's define vicarious financial trauma again, because it's such a powerful concept. It's internalizing someone else's financial pain, their fear, or their loss, without you having directly experienced that loss yourself.
And this often starts in childhood, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Witnessing the emotional fallout around money.
Oh, absolutely. Parents fighting constantly about bills, just the ambient stress in the house, or seeing them go through an unexpected catastrophic loss.
The case study of Megan and Joel, that high-income couple from New York City, it just illustrates this perfectly.
It really does. They were earning plenty of money, but they were living paycheck to paycheck, completely drowning in consumer debt.
And Joel, the primary breadwinner, he felt this intense, paralyzing shame. He described himself as feeling like an idiot.
And the source identifies that shame as a classic trauma response. It just hijacks your logic. It overrides any effective problem solving. His reaction was pure fight-flight hypervigilance, trying to out-earn his chronic stress.
But Megan had the complete opposite response.
Complete opposite. Deep avoidance coupled with chronic overspending. Her underlying trauma script was so revealing. It was, why save for tomorrow when you can lose it all in an instant?
And that attitude came directly from watching her parents lose everything. Their entire savings were tied up in a house they were building, and then her father had a debilitating illness.
And then she had to watch her mother spiral into alcoholism just to cope with the aftermath. So Megan internalized all of those emotional scars, and they became the blueprint for her own financial behavior. This live for today, spend it now outlook.
It's just fascinating how that observed trauma can drive behavior even decades later. Their high income was just masking this deep, unaddressed trauma conflict.
And this internalized fear, it goes way beyond just family dynamics. It's socialized into us. We're heavily conditioned to view financial struggle with a kind of disdain.
You just have to think about the automatic negative judgment we often apply to individuals who are experiencing homelessness.
Right. And the source material suggests this disdain is often just mislabeled fear. It's our own subconscious terror of ending up in that same vulnerable position.
And that fear, it encourages this really pervasive pattern of faking it until you make it. People go to extreme lengths to hide their financial problems.
Buying things they can't afford, using debt to maintain appearances, it's all driven by shame and fear. And it just digs people deeper and deeper into debt, no matter what their actual income is.
We also have to recognize that the triggers for this kind of vicarious trauma go way beyond our immediate family. They touch on this deep systemic history.
Absolutely. We have to acknowledge the institutional abuse that creates this widespread generational financial injury. Things like redlining, discriminatory lending practices,
Predatory loans, denial of deposited funds, or even historical examples of the intentional destruction of community wealth, like the Tulsa Massacre.
These are real, tangible acts of financial harm, and it also happens on an interpersonal level.
Yes, the misuse of money to manipulate or control family members, or that devastating but sadly common practice of someone opening credit cards or utility accounts in a child's name, just destroying their credit before they're even an adult.
And all of these things, whether you experience them or just observe them, they breed these behaviors: extreme hypervigilance in saving or deep money avoidance.
Or even that cultural practice of acquiring pawnable assets like gold or jewelry.
Exactly. These aren't irrational choices. They are survival tactics that have been coded into people in response to the very systems that inflicted the harm in the first place.
And that brings us to the systems themselves.
Yeah.
Part of the trauma we experience is just from existing within ecological systems that are fundamentally unstable, or in some cases, intentionally exploitative.
Right. The sources bring up ecological systems theory, which is just a way of reminding us that to really understand an individual's struggles, you have to look at the context of their interactions, their community, the economy, the laws they live under.
Poverty, for example, isn't just a mindset. It is a state of being that's curated externally by policy and by environment.
A really powerful example of this is the phenomenon known as the benefits cliff.
This is a very real, mathematically terrifying fear for anyone who's trying to navigate public assistance.
It is. It's the point where a small, seemingly positive increase in your income, like a small raise at work, it results in a disproportionately large loss of your public assistance benefits.
Things like subsidized housing, childcare, food programs.
Exactly. The loss in benefits is often far greater than the actual income gain.
So from a purely logical standpoint, trying to achieve upward mobility becomes actively irrational.
Precisely. And clients who are faced with this systemic trap, they often feel this profound guilt and shame because they want to be independent, but they literally cannot afford to risk losing the foundational resources they need to survive.
So the trauma of poverty isn't just about the lack of money.
No, it's the continuous high-stakes navigation of these complex punitive systems. And that trauma creates this ripple effect of chronic anxiety that can persist for years, even after someone has theoretically escaped that reality.
And then we come to the modern workplace, which so often exploits this exact ambition and anxiety.
Oh, absolutely. The author details his own journey. Being super results-driven, chasing titles, and equating his performance with his survival, all because of his past scarcity. He was the perfect corporate citizen.
But that intense drive, which was fueled by a desire for safety, it actually exposed him to a specific kind of trauma exploitation.
And this is where the analysis gets really critical. The corporate structure, our sources argue, uses scarcity and competition as a mechanism of control. The employee is constantly viewed as human capital, not as a human being.
The corporation requires compliance, productivity, and a lot of emotional labor.
It does. And I know this is a provocative comparison, but the sources draw a very explicit parallel between the modern workplace and the rationale of chattel slavery.
Okay, let's unpack that, because for a listener, that comparison might sound shocking. How do the sources justify that link?
The justification lies in the philosophical bedrock of both systems. In chattel slavery, an enslaved person's value was quantified solely by their productivity and their utility to the owner. Their identity, their family, their personal desires were completely suppressed.
Right.
The modern corporate structure, while obviously lacking the horrific legal and physical violence of slavery, often operates on that same core economic rationale. Your value is perpetually measured by how much you produce for the system.
And your productivity is prioritized over your humanity, your need for rest, your emotional well-being.
Which leads to the source's really chilling conclusion: rest is rebellion. If you are not actively producing, you are not considered valuable, which, for someone with a trauma history of instability, feels like a direct threat to their survival.
The system just forces people into these deeply entrenched trauma responses. You mentioned one called fawning.
Yes, fawning is a survival mechanism. It's used to seek security and attachment through extreme people-pleasing and compliance.
And in the workplace, this translates directly to conditioned compliance and the exhausting necessity of code switching.
Exactly. Whether it's adopting what's called a white voice in professional settings, or changing your natural hairstyle to appear more professional, or just masking aspects of your cultural identity.
It's an economic survival strategy. You're abandoning pieces of your authentic self. The author mentions he stopped wearing earrings after an arbitrary comment from a manager just to remain non-threatening and palatable.
And when your economic security, your very livelihood, is tied to presenting an inauthentic version of yourself, That is a form of financial trauma. It shows up in the constant low-level stress of that cognitive dissonance. You feel like you have the illusion of choice, but not genuine freedom.
Okay, so we've established the sources of the trauma. That's exposure. Now we have to move into the second E, education. We need to understand the biological and psychological mechanisms behind all this financial stress.
Right. It's not enough to know the problem exists. We have to understand how it literally lives in our bodies and changes our ability to make decisions.
So let's start with the biology.
To understand the physical side of financial stress, the sources use a conceptual framework called the triune brain model. You have the reptilian brain, which is instinct and survival.
The mammalian or limbic system, which is emotions, the danger monitor.
Right, and that's where the amygdala lives. And then you have the neocortex, or the prefrontal cortex, which is for rational thought, planning, and long-term decision-making.
So when a financial stressor hits, let's say you open an unexpected medical bill or you realize your bank account is overdrawn, the amygdala, which is the brain's danger sensor, it just triggers instantly.
Instantly. And that trigger automatically activates your autonomic nervous system. It floods your body with survival hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. This is your fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response.
And when that happens, trauma literally changes how the brain resources itself.
It does. It allows the survival brain, the limbic system, to override and suppress the rational problem-solving prefrontal cortex. That is the physical experience of panic, of not being able to think clearly.
So when you feel your heart racing, your palms are sweating, and you suddenly can't make a logical decision about whether to pay the minimum on a bill or the full balance, that's not a personal failing.
No, not at all. That's not a lack of intelligence. That's your prefrontal cortex momentarily shutting down and your body going into a full-blown survival response.
It's instinctive, not logical.
It is instinctive. Your body believes a financial threat is equivalent to a physical attack, like a lion chasing you. And this goes even deeper when we look at epigenetics.
Okay, this is a complex one, so let's slow down and connect the dots here. We're talking about trauma being passed down biologically, not just through learned behavior.
Yes. If a parent or a grandparent lived through a period of prolonged instability, their body was constantly producing high levels of cortisol. That sustained stress can actually chemically tag their genes, influencing how those genes operate.
So it doesn't change the DNA sequence itself, but it changes the expression of it.
Exactly. And this can result in the next generations inheriting a nervous system that is perpetually hyper-alert or highly sensitive to uncertainty. It requires less stress to trigger a full-blown survival response.
You're basically pre-programmed for hypervigilance or avoidance because your ancestors' environment demanded it for their survival.
It has profound implications for things like long-term financial planning. The author shared that his father genuinely believed he would not live past the age of 30.
Which is tragically common in communities that face systemic violence and instability.
So if your physiological inheritance is a constant state of threat, and your expectation is that the future is short and uncertain, how can you genuinely conceptualize saving for retirement, or contributing to a college fund, or buy and hold investing?
It seems illogical.
The shadow barrier to long-term ownership or stability might not be educational at all. It might be physiological, rooted in a nervous system that registers long-term planning as a waste of energy because survival requires constant, immediate resource management.
It connects historical systems directly to our present-day behavior. What if the shadow barrier to wealth accumulation in historically marginalized communities isn't a knowledge gap, but a physiological trauma response?
A response rooted in unreconciled pain from generations when economic independence was either impossible or literally dangerous. It's a population conditioned to react through the lens of pure survival.
And this physiological response feeds directly into our psychology, especially through money shame.
Yes. The author traces his first memory of money-related shame all the way back to age 7 at a scholastic book fair. He watched other kids effortlessly buying books and popular things that he knew he couldn't afford.
And that led to snickers and comments from other kids about his clothes not being brand name.
And that feeling, that acute, isolating shame, it contributes directly to the development of our subconscious money scripts.
To really validate the breadth of these experiences, the sources categorize financial trauma using the trauma scope, big T versus little t.
Right. Big T trauma includes those flashpoint events we mentioned: bankruptcy, foreclosure, a mass layoff. But the vast majority of people are dealing with little t trauma.
Which would be the constant, smaller financial threats.
Exactly. Parents frequently fighting about money, living in that perpetual paycheck-to-paycheck instability, enduring a toxic work culture, or even just the cycle of shame after you engage in retail therapy.
And these small, constant threats, they induce chronic cortisol production. They keep the nervous system continuously dysregulated.
And this chronic shame, it just locks people into a destructive pattern, the cycle of money avoidance.
Okay, let's break this down step by step with a common example.
Sure. The cycle starts with a financial stressor, like an unexpected car repair bill. This causes an immediate surge of shame or trauma. I'm a failure for not being prepared for this.
And that shame then drives avoidance behavior. You leave the repair bill unopened on the counter, you refuse to check your bank account balance.
Which, of course, leads to negative financial consequences. Now you have late fees, your anxiety is even higher, which then significantly amplifies the initial shame and trauma.
And you're just stuck in this self-reinforcing loop that makes it impossible to gain any kind of control.
And we see this play out in the 4 main money scripts, which are these subconscious beliefs we develop in childhood that guide all our behavior around money.
Let's start with the 2 most common ones. Money avoidance, which is rejecting responsibility for your financial health. The belief that money is the root of all evil or is inherently corrupting.
Then there's money status, which is equating your self-worth with your net worth. It's that relentless pursuit of material things or social markers, the classic keeping up with the Joneses scenario, which often feels just reckless debt.
Okay, now let's look at the others, which often carry a deeper generational context.
Right. Money worship is the belief that if you just had more money, you would be happier. This leads to workaholism, sacrificing your well-being for profit.
And for Black Americans, the source notes this script can be embraced as a progressive alternative to avoidance.
Yes, it's almost like a declaration. I refuse to be the victim my ancestors were. I'm going to use capitalism to buy my way out of systemic oppression. It's that CREAM culture, driven by the trauma of being powerless.
And finally, there's money vigilance,
which is characterized by extreme attentiveness, anxiety, and this deep distrust of others and of the financial system itself.
While this script often shows up in high-income earners who are protecting their wealth, we also see it powerfully in people with very limited means.
The emotional driver is identical: fear of loss and the desire for control. It doesn't matter if your cash is stockpiled in a highly diversified brokered account or if it's physically stashed under your mattress.
The underlying distress comes from a justified distrust of systems that have historically proven to be unstable or discriminatory or predatory.
This vigilance is just an echo of generational trauma, prompting this hyper-control in an effort to prevent any future harm.
So given all of this, the biology, the psychology, why does traditional financial advice fail so spectacularly?
Because it's almost never trauma-informed. It's not culturally contextualized, and it's not sensitive to the body's reaction at all.
There's a difference between financial knowledge, which is just knowing facts, and financial literacy, which adds conceptual understanding and critical thinking.
And traditional literacy usually leads with guilt and shame. It's the, if you would just stop spending money on lattes, you'd be fine argument.
But the personal physiological experience will override all of those facts every single time.
Absolutely. The author shares this just devastating anecdote that captures this perfectly. He paid $300 for a wealth seminar that just shamed him. They were berating attendees for accepting mediocrity.
And that shame pushed him into spending $12,000 of his savings on a follow-up coaching program.
He was sold a dream that was fueled by his own desperation, and then the coach just ghosted him after collecting the money.
I can only imagine the terror of that. He knew logically that $12,000 was a massive chunk of his limited savings, but that emotional plea to change his family's future just overrode all logic.
He describes shivering violently as he signed the contract.
Yeah.
His body was literally telling him to flee, but his traumatized survival brain told him to stay and fight, believing this was his only chance to escape scarcity.
Fear and uncertainty completely overrode the rational planning part of his brain.
The lesson here is so crucial. Financial literacy has to be delivered as an anchor. It must be trauma-informed, cultural, and physiological to actually stick and change behavior. Otherwise, it's just another magic bullet solution that targets the symptoms, not the deep behavioral roots.
And we see the ultimate rejection of traditional literacy in this concept of willful non-participation.
Yes. Citing FDIC data, the sources point out that 5.6 million U.S. households are still unbanked, and the rates are several times higher in minority households.
And for many of these people, this isn't about ignorance of how banks work. It's not a lack of financial knowledge.
No, it's an active, conscious choice. It is a refusal to engage with systems that have historically caused them harm, denied them dignity, or that represent a perceived threat to their safety.
So non-participation is not ignorance, it's memory.
It is memory. It is avoidance being used as a survival strategy, where the perceived risk of engaging with the system far outweighs any potential benefit. They opt out because their ancestors, or they themselves, paid a very real price for participation.
Okay, we've moved through exposure and education. We've gained the awareness and the understanding. Now we get to the crucial, actionable phase, execution.
This is where we stop just talking about the trauma and we start taking real action to metabolize it and create fundamental, lasting change.
And it starts with rewriting your financial narrative and your identity.
Exactly. Your financial narrative is that whole belief system you carry about money. It's a combination of your conscious money stories and your subconscious money scripts.
So healing involves consciously choosing what stays, what evolves, and what has to be consciously left behind.
It's a transition from automatic reactive responses to intentional deliberate action. And this means intentionally claiming your financial identity. The goal here is not a dollar amount, it's an alignment with your values.
So the question to ask yourself is, who am I becoming financially?
Right. It requires a values-driven decision. Am I becoming someone who prioritizes security, someone who lives in abundance, a good steward? You're creating a safe, intentional identity rather than just living in reaction to your past trauma.
The sources outline that this rewriting has to happen on 3 integrated levels: mind, body, and soul. Because trauma is a full-body event, not just a thought process.
For the mind level, this involves cognitive restructuring. You identify a negative money script, and then you actively argue against it with evidence from your present life.
But the real power, it seems, is in the body and the soul. So how do we execute healing on the body level? The sources emphasize somatic practices.
Right. On the body level, you learn to track the physical sensations of stress. So when you get a stressful email about money, you pause and you notice where that tension settles. Is it in your jaw, your shoulders, your stomach?
And a somatic body scan involves acknowledging that tension.
And then consciously engaging your vagus nerve to signal safety to your body. For example, if you feel anxiety when you're thinking about asking for a raise, you might pause and do a 6-second exhale breath to actively downregulate your nervous system before you even pick up the phone.
You're teaching your body that this task is not an actual threat to your survival.
Exactly. And then there's the soul level. This sounds a bit more abstract, but the material insists it's crucial for clearing those inherited patterns.
So what does that look like?
It involves deep, reflective work, future self visualizations, and ancestral reflections. The visualization involves actively stepping into your desired financial identity 5 years from now.
And you're not just seeing the things you own, but you're feeling the feeling of safety and abundance.
Precisely. And for ancestral reflection, you consciously honor the immense survival skills your ancestors demonstrated. I mean, they survived war, famine, systemic injustice.
And then you consciously assess which of those survival skills still serve me today, like resourcefulness.
And which old fear-based patterns, like stockpiling cash or hiding money, am I choosing to clear for my future self and for my children?
To protect this new identity, boundaries are essential.
Absolutely. Financial boundaries are personal guidelines you establish to protect your financial decisions, especially against 2 things. Your internal trauma responses, like self-soothing with retail therapy.
And external pressures, like family members constantly asking you for money.
They exist solely to protect your safety and your chosen identity.
The sources provide a really robust 3-part framework for setting trauma-responsive boundaries. The first step is to audit your values.
Yes. You have to separate what you value, like friendship or family, from the associated money events. You can still value friendship intensely without agreeing to spend $200 on bottle service at a club.
By clarifying that your value isn't tied to the spending, the boundary becomes so much easier to uphold.
The second step is to establish SMART goals. Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. But they must be explicitly tied to your personal safety.
So instead of a vague goal like save more money, a trauma-responsive goal would be something like save $500 in a separate account by the end of the month so I have 3 months of housing security in case I lose my job.
That creates a clear bias toward action because the goal is directly enhancing your safety. And third, you have to communicate.
This is where the rubber meets the road.
It is. You have to practice specific scripts. and you provide alternatives to maintain the connection while upholding your boundary. If a friend invites you on an expensive trip, instead of just saying, I can't afford that,
You use a non-shaming script.
something like, that sounds amazing, but my financial safety plan right now is prioritizing debt paydown. I'd love to join you for the first day, but I'm going to skip the expensive resort dinner. Let's plan a cheaper activity instead.
And critically, you have to remember that in many cases, especially with family, no is a complete sentence. It needs no further explanation.
This communication piece is especially critical when you're dealing with what's called survivor's remorse.
This is that quiet grief and guilt, that deep sense of alienation that's often felt by first-generation high earners whose success creates this economic and emotional distance from their family and community.
That remorse is such a powerful trigger for boundary bending. It causes them to overspend on family or give away large sums of money or even sabotage their own success.
Not because they're bad with money, but because they're desperately trying to relieve that emotional burden and regain acceptance or just feel normal again within their original community.
Healing from that requires acknowledging the grief of that separation and then upholding the boundaries despite that emotional cost.
Which leads to what is maybe the biggest paradigm shift the sources promote: dismantling the myth of radical individualism.
Yes, the material states this so emphatically. The myth of individualism is propaganda designed specifically to isolate you. Historically and biologically, the individual will perish. Humans are tribal. We require community and interdependence to thrive.
You shouldn't have to be some extraordinary isolated genius just to achieve financial safety.
And this idea of individualism is so baked into the American ethos, especially around money. But the sources argue that collectivism is the actual game being played on every level but yours.
You see it in corporate bailouts, union organizing, even Social Security.
We have to reclaim interdependence, mutual aid, and shared resources. The sources reference Dr. Claude Anderson's model for systemic power through group economics,
Which is all about advocating for circulating wealth and resources within trusted networks to create this exponential benefit for everyone.
The author gave a really practical example of this. Instead of renting, he bought a duplex and arranged for his mother and stepfather to live in one of the units.
So he saved money on his mortgage because of the rental income.
Yeah. And they saved money on their housing expenses. They achieved mutual financial freedom through interdependence. They used their community as a wealth-building amplifier.
And to operationalize this, you need to build a diverse support team across 5 categories.
That's right. You need accountability partners, trusted peers who will hold you to your goals without shame or judgment. Professional guides, financial therapists, planners, and coaches who are trauma-informed.
You also need peer networks. Your tribe, the people who are in the trenches with you, normalizing the conversation about struggle.
And vendors, the functional service providers like a trustworthy banker, a lawyer, a CPA, and finally, collaborators, business partners, or community members who see your success as mutually beneficial.
Healing happens in spaces where you are truly seen, heard, and held, not in isolation.
And we have to keep coming back to this crucial point. Trauma is stored in the body, so talk therapy alone can only name the trauma. Somatic practices are necessary to metabolize it and release it from the nervous system.
This brings us to bottom-up regulation.
Exactly. Traditional mindfulness is a top-down approach. You use your rational neocortex to calm your emotional limbic system. Bottom-up regulation is the opposite. You actively engage your body to soothe the nervous system via the vagus nerve.
So techniques like rhythmic humming, drumming, rocking, movement.
These are essentially ancestral technologies designed specifically for nervous system regulation. When panic hits, your body is in fight or flight. Engaging the vagus nerve through deep, prolonged exhalations or humming actually sends a signal to your brainstem that you are safe.
So if you get a stressful phone call, instead of reacting, you could hum for 60 seconds or do some deep diaphragmatic breathing.
And you are actively forcing your body out of that stress response, restoring the prefrontal cortex's ability to engage logic. It allows you to choose an intentional response instead of a reactive one.
The sources also explored more energetic forms of healing, like Reiki. How does something like that connect to financial trauma?
The material referenced a financial therapist and Reiki master named Stephen Hughes, who describes Reiki as balancing energy centers, or chakras.
And financial trauma profoundly impacts the lower chakras.
Yes. The root chakra, which is associated with survival, stability, and safety. The sacral chakra, associated with shame and emotions. And the solar plexus, which is about personal power and boundaries.
Trauma, he suggests, keeps you from being your whole self.
So somatic and energetic healing helps clear these blocked areas, fostering a sense of wholeness and embodied security that's necessary for you to have financial agency.
And finally, we have to honor decolonized healing. We often dismiss indigenous or ancestral practices as purely mystical, but they are time-tested technologies for nervous system regulation and community healing.
Absolutely. Practices like ancestral veneration, drumming circles, intentional movement, many of which have been performed for millennia, are powerful tools for connection and self-regulation. We integrate this wisdom, recognizing that the inherent resilience, the wisdom, and the survival gifts of our ancestors are valid and necessary sources of healing, not just abstract concepts.
They carried the blueprint. Now we choose which parts to keep and which to clear.
So, this healing journey demands mutual accountability. From the individual, yes, but also from the very systems that cause the initial harm.
For institutions like banks and financial service providers to genuinely rebuild trust, especially with all this history of systemic harm, they have to first own the hurt.
This means going way beyond just a PR statement. We saw J.P. Morgan Chase's 2005 acknowledgement of its historical ties to slavery. That's a start, but owning the hurt has to be operationalized.
It has to be put into practice through transparency, proactive repair, and trauma-responsive practices throughout their operations.
The sources introduced the trust framework as a guide for these institutions and as a standard for consumers to demand.
Its trauma-responsive approach, relationship building, unpacking internalized biases.
Which means the financial professional has to recognize their own money scripts.
Supportive frameworks and training and continuous improvement.
Let's make that concrete for the listener. If you, the consumer, walk into a bank, that R for relationship building means the interaction isn't purely transactional.
It means the banker is trained to approach your financial goals with curiosity, not with judgment.
Exactly. Instead of just immediately denying a loan application, they engage in a supportive conversation to understand the history of your financial instability and maybe offer alternative supportive frameworks, like working with a financial coach first. The onus is on the institution to adapt to the client's trauma history, not shame them for it.
And for leaders and HR professionals, the message is also clear. Traditional corporate financial wellness programs are failing.
They're failing because they assume financial problems are purely educational. They're often boring, full of jargon, and they focus on compliance rather than on actual healing.
So a truly trauma-responsive program has to be rooted in financial trauma literacy for everyone, from management to employees.
It absolutely has to. First, it needs to prioritize somatic and emotional regulation work, because we know regulated people make rational, aligned decisions, while dysregulated people react from a place of fear.
Second, it has to focus on community, not individualism. It needs to facilitate structured, safe conversations where employees can share their experiences without fear of professional reprisal.
And third, and this is critical, it must include culture and customization. The content has to be adapted for specific affinity groups, first-generation professionals, veterans, LGBTQ+ individuals, and address their unique financial trauma sources and historical context.
So those who have navigated their own healing journey and have achieved financial security, the journey then naturally shifts toward purpose and legacy.
And this requires consciously transitioning from a mentality of scarcity to surplus, recognizing that wealth is all around us and that scarcity is often manufactured to keep people compliant and in fear.
This calls for moving beyond traditional, often ego-driven charity that just treats symptoms while leaving the systemic causes completely untouched.
Right. Community reinvestment focuses on addressing those systemic gaps funding microloans, teaching essential financial skills, or directly supporting local entrepreneurship that circulates wealth within underserved communities. It's about building long-term resilience.
And we have to practice social responsibility now. This includes redirecting your autopilot charitable giving toward vetted grassroots initiatives that address root trauma.
Or starting a giving circle with your peers to amplify your impact, and actively auditing your investments to make sure your profits are not being derived from companies that cause harm or contribute to systemic oppression.
Your personal healing really lays the ethical and emotional foundation for the healing of future generations.
Because intentional giving, when it's aligned with your values, acts as a powerful nervous system regulator. It affirms that you are no longer operating from a state of scarcity or fear, but from a position of security and abundance.
We started this deep dive with that 3 E's roadmap. We gained exposure to generational, vicarious, and systemic trauma. We received education on the biological reality of shame and survival. And now we have the tools for execution through somatic healing, boundary setting, and building a collective support system.
This is a journey of intentionality and self-compassion. It's something that you practice daily.
And you should always remember this. The trauma you carry related to money is not your fault.
But the responsibility for engaging in your healing is yours. This profound knowledge demands accountability from us all.
Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. This is intense and it's necessary work, and we really appreciate you leaning into the challenge with us.
If personal agency is defined as the power to choose, can you choose to make your healing and the resulting financial safety a collective mission instead of just a private accomplishment?